Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Continual Improvement webinar on what's new in quality and regulatory expectations for laboratories in 2022. This is Melissa Peterson, a Senior Education Specialist for Mayo Clinic Laboratories. Our presenters today are Shannon Bennett, Director of Regulatory Affairs in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology, and Jennifer Nospish, a CLIA Compliance Manager in the Integrity and Compliance Office, both at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Just a couple of things to remind everyone of before we begin today. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the program. You can submit questions online via the Q&A icon on Zoom. Please only use the chat function for any technical issues. Today's program is being recorded and will be posted to our website in a few weeks. And now I will hand it over to our presenters.
Very good. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. This is Shannon Bennett, along with my colleague, Jenny Nospish. So today we'll be talking about some current goings-on with quality and regulatory for labs. We don't have any relevant financial disclosures. I'm going to kick things off by talking about the VALID Act. This is not a new topic. Jenny and I have been doing this series for probably the last 5 years, and I have talked about VALID previously, but there is some news and some updates to share with everyone. And I'll also be talking about another piece of legislation called PAMA and some challenges that labs have with it, and a piece of legislation that might be working to address that. And then finally, Jenny is going to go in depth about what we can expect with the COVID public health emergency potentially ending next year. So starting with VALID, it is an acronym, of course, Verifying Accurate Leading Edge IVCT Development Act. And an IVCT is a potential new product class that would be regulated by FDA called an in vitro clinical test. And this is an umbrella term for in vitro diagnostic test kits, which today are regulated by the FDA as medical devices, and laboratory developed tests, which broadly speaking are not regulated by the FDA today. So again, last year I went into some detail about the history of FDA regulation of lab developed tests, as well as the content of the VALID Act. So certainly welcome you taking a look at our previous presentations on this. VALID's been a little bit of a long road for laboratories. So a discussion draft of the legislation was first introduced in November of 2018, and the bill was introduced in Congress in March of 2020. Of course, that was exactly at the time when COVID was starting to ramp up. So the legislation didn't ever really go anywhere. However, it was reintroduced the following summer, and laboratories and other stakeholders provided a lot of input on the bill, things we liked, things we didn't like, changes we wanted to see. And then Congress went quiet for quite some time. And I think the assumption was VALID maybe wasn't going to go anywhere yet again. But then this past summer, a new version began to be circulated with some very significant edits. And in my opinion, a lot of those edits were actually positive for lab. I think the bill moved more in lab's direction. And the reason for all this new energy around VALID was because a legislative vehicle had appeared. So VALID is very unlikely to pass on its own. It would most likely be attached to another piece of legislation. And so there was a must-pass piece of legislation for FDA funding that was coming up for a vote at the end of September for user fees. And the thought was that VALID would get attached to that because it is FDA related. However, at the last minute, VALID was stripped out of the user fee legislation. And so that legislation did pass, but VALID was not included. And so now the path forward most likely will be its inclusion in an end of the year omnibus spending bill. However, you'll note that it is mid-December, there's not a lot of the year left. So the omnibus spending bill technically is due this Friday. However, I think it's likely that there will be a continuing resolution and it will be pushed out a week. But we should know within the next week and a half whether VALID will be part of that omnibus spending bill and will go into effect or not. If you were to ask my opinion today, I think it's more likely than not, but it changes day to day and the language of the bill is being tweaked as we speak. So VALID does have a lot of proponents. So certainly industry is pro-VALID, FDA wants VALID. A lot of patient advocacy and patient safety groups are also supportive of VALID. And there are also some industry groups. The College of American Pathologists has come out in support of VALID, the American Clinical Laboratory Association, ASCLS. So there is a lot of support for FDA regulation of laboratory developed tests. However, there are also those who have concerns. So many, if not most, academic medical centers have expressed opposition to VALID, as well as many professional societies like AACC, ASM, AMP, the list goes on and on. And the concern with those groups is that they have very large LDT test menus, and so VALID would be hugely impactful to them, which is a reasonable concern. And so those groups are expressing a lot of concerns around VALID. So if you've been looking at trade press the last couple of weeks, you've probably seen a lot of op-eds, both for and against VALID. And I know a lot of the professional societies are also sending out email notices to their constituencies, asking them to contact their congressional representatives to push back against VALID. So again, things are still very much in flux. So what could happen? There are really obviously two options. One, VALID passes. So at a high level, any test that's currently offered to patients would be grandfathered, meaning we would not need to submit any validation documentation to the FDA for those tests. If we modify those tests in the future, we may need to submit validation documentation to the FDA. There's a 5-year transition period. So for the first 2 to 3 years, FDA would be generating a lot of guidance documents describing how they're going to regulate LDTs and how laboratories should interact with the FDA. And then the final 2 to 3 years would be laboratories coming into compliance with all those guidance documents. And certainly there will need to be a significant education push here as well, because laboratories by and large, we don't speak FDA. And so we have a lot that we'll need to learn about how FDA works and operates. But the bottom line is this will be a significant change for labs. There's really no way around that if FDA does begin regulating our LDTs. Now, silver lining, many of us have had some experience with FDA over COVID because maybe we've done emergency use authorizations for LDTs related to COVID testing. I know we also have supported some clinical trials. And so occasionally you need to submit what's called an investigational device exemption for a test. So, I and probably others on this call have had some experience working with FDA, and I can say that they typically want more than we're used to generating. They want more studies, more samples, more robust documentation. So laboratories just need to be prepared. If VALID passes, they will likely need additional resources to develop, validate, and submit tests to the FDA. So we need to be prepared for that. So what happens if VALID doesn't pass? So it's not included in the end of the year omnibus spending bill. Well, first of all, I think that probably means VALID as a piece of legislation is dead, in my opinion. I think it's been 4 years that this has been worked on. If it doesn't get over the finish line this time around, I think it's probably done. So in the short term, it'll be status quo. So we'll continue operating under CLIA and CAP or any other regulatory and accrediting agency that you're used to working with, and nothing will really change. However, FDA has signaled very clearly, particularly in the last month, that they would really like to regulate LDTs, whether it's through VALID or through some other mechanism. So there are 3 primary ways that FDA flexes their regulatory authority. One is they can issue guidance. So they just publish, here's how we're going to regulate LDTs. They did try that in 2014 and it didn't go particularly well. There was a lot of pushback from industry and that guidance was never finalized. So that's been tried, didn't work. The other option is legislation and getting Congress involved. That's the VALID Act. So if VALID doesn't pass, then that mechanism is kind of not viable either. So the third way is what's called notice and comment rulemaking, where the agency will again publish, here's how we propose regulating LDTs in this case, and the public has an opportunity to provide comments back to FDA, things they like, things they don't like, suggestions, etc. Now, FDA doesn't need to accept those comments, but they do need to address all of them. Just by way of comparison, when CLIA was originally passed in the late 80s, there were something like 90,000 public comments. So this can be a lengthy process, probably years. But at the end of the day, ultimately, by using this approach, FDA could potentially be regulating LDTs at the end of it. Also in parallel, FDA could lift their enforcement discretion. So FDA has always claimed that they have the authority to regulate LDTs, they just choose not to, they use enforcement discretion. They could go in a targeted fashion and try to more vigorously regulate particular tests. So they have released safety notices in the last couple of years on a few types of tests that I think would be high on the list: pharmacogenetics testing, as well as newborn screening testing. So that's a possibility as well. But the bottom line is, if VALID doesn't pass, FDA will still probably be involved in clinical laboratories in some way, shape, or form, but it will be a much longer, messier, i.e. lawsuits process. So we'll keep a close eye on what happens in the next week and a half. And I think that will really set the tone for how we move forward with LDTs and FDA regulation. So changing topics, let's talk about PAMA. So PAMA is the Protecting Access to Medicare Act. This was a piece of legislation that was passed in 2014. And PAMA does a lot of things, but one of the things it does is try to corral spending on laboratory tests. So Medicare pays over $8 billion a year for laboratory testing. And so they want to make sure that they're getting the best deal for their money. Prior to PAMA, there were numerous local fee schedules that were used for reimbursement rates for tests. And that reimbursement was based on an average rate. So if you got a CBC in Arkansas, the reimbursement might be different than a CBC that was done in Utah, for example. And these rates did increase occasionally to keep up with inflation, but it was very infrequent. So the reimbursement functionally went down because inflation outstripped the reimbursement rate. The other problem is that as more complex tests came to market, the fee schedules didn't necessarily do a great job for accounting for that. So think next-gen sequencing, for example. So overall, the process was viewed as complex, clunky, and gimmicky. So PAMA sought to address all of this. So PAMA introduced one national fee schedule, the Clinical Laboratory Fee Schedule, or CLFS. Reimbursement was based on private payer rates. So CMS would go out and collect data on how much laboratories were charging for tests. And this data collection would be every 3 years. It was a very onerous, or is a very onerous data collection process. A lot of information, takes a lot of resources to gather it. The goal was, though, that it would add predictability to the fee schedule. And ultimately, the goal would be to save Medicare money. There's one glaring issue, though, with how this was accomplished. And that is, if you don't collect the totality of data and you exclude certain data, you don't have a complete picture. So what happened is CMS created this concept of an applicable laboratory. And they defined this as a laboratory that received an entity that received a little over $12,000 in Medicare revenues from laboratory services, and where greater than 50% of the revenues were from laboratory and physician services. And this was calculated by using an MPI number. So the problem here is that many physician office laboratories don't get at least $12,000 of their Medicare revenue from laboratory services, so they wouldn't count. And in addition, a lot of hospital outreach labs, and again, physician office labs, don't have a separate, distinct NPI number. So what happened is a lot of laboratories were excluded from this data collection. So there's a lot going on here. Let me just walk through this very quickly. There are 3 types of labs, generally speaking. We have independent laboratories, so think reference labs, physician office labs, which are by far and away the largest number of laboratories, and then hospital laboratories. So using this applicable laboratory calculation, CMS determined that these are the number of laboratories that we need to report. So about half of the independent laboratories, about 5% of physician office laboratories, and no hospital laboratories, they calculated, would meet this applicable laboratory standard. And so you can see even fewer than actually went through and did report because of the burden of doing so. And we also had 21 brave hospital labs that went ahead and submitted anyway, despite perhaps not meeting the definition of applicable laboratory. And so you can see here that the numbers are very heavily weighted towards independent labs. And part of the problem with that is these tend to be your very high volume laboratories where they've got great economies of scale. So of course, their price per test is going to be lower compared to like a hospital laboratory, which is seeing critically ill patients, maybe has more esoteric testing, more expensive testing. And so that led to a pretty significant problem. So this initial data collection was retrospective. It used a weighted median instead of a mean. And that ultimately led to a preference for volume of testing over the true average price. And so the net result of this is really draconian pay cuts. So about 3/4 of the tests on the fee schedule faced payment cuts, and some of them were significant. So for example, the CBC saw a cut of 35%. Some drug tests saw a cut of 59%. So just imagine overnight, the amount you're being reimbursed for your drug tests is cut in half. It's really difficult to run a laboratory like that. So as is typically the case when a constituency doesn't agree with how the government is doing something, there was a lawsuit. So the American Clinical Laboratory Association sued the Department of Health and Human Services in 2017. And the grounds were that CMS and Health and Human Services really twisted the intent of PAMA's data collection provisions by using this concept of an applicable laboratory and how that was defined. So there were a lot of twists and turns with the case, but ultimately ACLA was victorious, and it was ruled that CMS's the way they calculated these rates was arbitrary and capricious and damaged laboratories. So kind of along with this, there were a number of delays. So the first 3-year reporting period ended in 2017, and so that data was collected. The second deadline was set for March of 2020. And again, as I mentioned previously, labs were a little busy with other stuff in March of 2020. So through a series of legislation, the Lab Act and the CARES Act, that deadline was moved out to 2021 and then 2022, where we are today. Also during this time, there was a report by MedPAC. So MedPAC is a research entity that advises Medicare on a variety of things. And they studied this issue of laboratory reimbursement. And they verified, sure enough, independent laboratories were overrepresented in the first round of data reporting. Interestingly, they found that by using the pay rates in that first round of data collection, a lot of commoditized routine tests saw significant decreases in payment, but a lot of newer and more expensive tests actually saw an increase in payment. So it wasn't necessarily even saving that much money, but it was hitting hospital labs and physician office labs very, very hard. The other kind of bad news side of the report is it found that even though the amount of testing remained relatively stable during the collection period, lab profits increased. The problem with that, though, is COVID testing was tucked in there. So it's true that a lot of laboratories, maybe did significantly more testing than typical, and so therefore made more money. But that was due to COVID testing, which is not a sustainable revenue stream, right? So I think the thought is as COVID testing starts decreasing, these rate decreases are going to hit laboratories especially hard. So that brings us to SALSA, the Saving Access to Laboratory Services Act. So SALSA seeks to address basically all of these issues with PAMA. So it uses or proposes to use statistical sampling. So rather than collecting all the data from everybody, it would instead collect subsets of data from subsets of institutions. So reducing that data collection burden, which is a significant problem with PAMA as it stands today. It also introduces a 5% limit for rate changes, so you don't see these dramatic swings in reimbursement. And it also extends the reporting period from every 3 years to every 4 years, again, to reduce that data collection burden. SALSA is also angling to be included in this end of the year omnibus spending bill, but in my opinion, I think it has a much tougher road than the VALID Act does. And in fact, I think it's fairly unlikely that SALSA is going to make the cut. So what that means is laboratories will continue to need to pay attention to this issue and continue fighting for reasonable reimbursement as we move into 2023. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Jenny.
Thank you, Shannon. And welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to switch gears completely and we're going to talk about CLIA, and we're going to talk, we'll spill into a few other things, but really talk about changes we've seen coming through this year. Next slide, please, Shannon. So I'm going to start off, first I want to start off by saying that everything on our slides are accurate as of today, but especially in this world, in the CLIA regulatory world, things are changing. And especially with the increase in enforcement discretions and the ending of the PHE, so things are pretty fluid right now. So let's start off with proficiency testing. This is something that back in July of this year, CMS finally published an updated proficiency testing requirements under CLIA. This has been in the process since, I believe, back in 2019 is when it started, and it was really finalized this year. So kind of falls into what Shannon was talking about, how it takes quite a bit of time to get some changes to happen, and this is a great example of that. So really this is published, you can find the document under QSO-22-21-CLIA. And it really, the intent of this was really to address current analytes and newer technologies. We all know that CLIA is many, many years old, and the initial PT regulations were actually established in 1992, and testing has advanced significantly since that point. So it was overdue for some changes here. So a few of those highlights include, there were some additions and deletions of analytes which require PT. So they actually added 29 non-micro analytes to the subpart I. They also made some modifications to microbiology regulations, actually quite a few changes to micro. So if you have some micro testing that you're doing, you might want to take a closer look at that. They removed certain types of services listed under each micro subspecialty, and then they also added categories for each micro subspecialties as well. There were some changes to definitions. They actually added a new definition for acceptance limits. Then the definition for target value was revised. There was also a definition of peer group was clarified with some technical edits that they had in there. So there was a few updates there from a definition perspective. The intent of this, like I said, was really to update the regulations to what our current practice is today in the laboratory. And it really was to align the CLIA regulations with the statute. And there's a big piece of that. It really, when they did that, they also extended the proficiency testing referral regulations for non-wave tests, also apply to wave tests if the wave tests are voluntarily participating in the PT programs. So we've heard that, we've known it, but they've updated the regulations to reflect that as well. There was a staggered effective date related to this. So they're delaying the effective date for the revisions to PT requirements for 2 years. So that would be July of 2024. However, the regulations related to labs performing moderate and high complexity testing that are also performing wave testing and the PT enrollment requirements, they are effective as of back in August actually of this year. So that covers PT. Next slide, please. The next document another document that CMS put out was back in February. They published it was really just a FAQ pretty much covering CLIA consumer complaints. So this is, I'm really giving this to you as more of an information only. They published this FAQ, a frequently asked questions document, and it really talks about what CLIA is, the types of things you can include in a CLIA complaint, who can file a complaint, how to file a complaint, those types of things. So they kind of put out information of, you got a complaint, this is how you take that complaint forward thing. So again, this is just an FYI that it's out there for you. Next slide, please. Temporary testing exception and remote review. Okay, so this is a big one. This was again back in February. The document is the QSO-22-13-CLIA for your reference. Maybe one you want to write down to kind of take a closer look at after this webinar. So this really clarified a couple different things. First, I'm going to talk about the temporary testing exemption. So it clarified their CLIA guidance during the PHE specific to the use of temporary testing multi-site exemptions. And it also told us about CMS's exercising enforcement discretion related to remote review of clinical lab data, results, and pathology slides. So I'm first going to touch on the whole temporary testing multi-site exemption piece, because that's a big one too. I'm going to break it down into two pieces. So current CLIA regulations allow laboratories to apply for that exception. There's actually 3 different exceptions I'll talk about that the current regulations allow. One of those, the first one is, well, I should say one of those is a temporary testing situations. So for this, labs that aren't at a fixed location, they go out, they move from testing site to testing site, mobile units, health fairs, temporary testing. So their home base is the home lab, but they take their personnel and their instruments and their supplies, and they go out someplace, do their testing, and they come back to that home base. So the oversight, the ownership, all of that is under that main location. So that's a temporary testing exemption. The second one is for not-for-profit, for federal, state, local governments that engage in limited public health testing. And there's regulations around that. It can't be a combination of 15 moderately complex or weight tests per certificate, those types of things. That can be under one certificate. And the third situations is very specific for labs that are within a hospital. They're located on a contiguous campus, on contiguous buildings or the same campus, and under common direction, common ownership, and things like that. So there's rules around there, but there is an exception in that. You need to apply for an exception to your CLIA certificate. It goes into the CMS database, so they know, where testing is being done, those types of things. So this document kind of came out and said, okay, during the PHE, let's not forget there is this temporary testing exemption that we can use in certain situations. So it kind of clarified that, talked a little bit about it, brought it to the forefront. You think about during the PHE, all the situations where testing was occurring, parking lots, drive-throughs, things like that, where this exemption could help laboratories out. So this document really talked about how you can operate under those in those temporary situations, and it really talked about how that allowed flexibility to labs during the PHE. It also clarified that labs need to communicate with their state agencies. They have to provide certain information. You can't just assume, hey, I'm going to do this under a temporary testing exemption and go rogue and do it on your own. There's communication that happens there. You have to have that approval. They need to know what you're doing, those types of things. So as you can imagine, there was many temporary testing sites used during the heart of the pandemic. So that's one piece of this document, was kind of clarifying that piece. Shannon, can you go to the next slide, please? Perfect. Remote review was the second part of this. And I break those out because in my mind, they are really 2 different things that we should focus on. So this document also clarified their CMS's enforcement discretion related to remote review of clinical lab data, results, and pathology slides. That was actually a different document. It was a QSO-20-21 that they first started talking about remote review. So flexibilities were put in place during the COVID PHE that have allowed pathologists and other lab professionals to read digital images and data from a remote location that's associated with an already established CLIA laboratory. So those were remote review type situations. So this document, remember, this was back in February, I think it was, when this first came out. The document said that CMS would not enforce the requirement of having a separate CLIA certificate for those remote locations, provided that the designated primary site or the home base had a CLIA certificate. The work being performed at the remote location falls within the parameters of that primary location certificate. And so there's parameters around there as well. So one of the big things they said was that a pathologist's home may be a remote testing site. Fast forward to the end of September, when CMS announced that they will continue to exercise enforcement discretion through the end of the current PHE. And at the end of the PHE, CMS will continue to exercise enforcement discretion for pathologists only to examine digital images and lab data at remote locations. So other lab staff will not be allowed to, that enforcement discretion will not be extended beyond the PHE for them. And so this is where all of us have different lab situations. And so it's important for you to know what your situation is, know what the documents say, to say, how does this fit into what I'm doing? I know a question that I hear often, I'm going to address it right now in case any of you have it, is what's the difference between having a CLIA certificate with a temporary testing exemption on it or having someone who's working remotely needing a CLIA certificate? And really the difference is when you have that temporary testing exemption on your CLIA certificate, there's parameters around that. Ownership, oversight are the same. Your employees and your instruments and all of that, all of your supplies are housed at the main laboratory, and you're taking it, you're going out to some place. A health fair is a great example. An ambulance is a great example. You're going out someplace, you're doing it on a temporary basis, and you're coming back to that main lab. Whereas these remote reviews are more of those, more on a permanent basis. So it may be once a week, or it may be for, it may be full time, but it may be once a week they work remotely. It's more of that. It's not a temporary situation. It's more of that permanent situation. So it's great, obviously, but that's kind of the explanation there. So a few takeaways, I think, the big pieces here, I think, for takeaways: post-PHE enforcement discretion for the other lab staff, other than pathologists, is not extended beyond the PHE, but it is for pathologists. In a few slides, I'll talk about the roadmap to NPHE, and this ties in there, very directly to that. So even though the remote review isn't necessarily in the roadmap document, this is very, very timely for that. So next slide, please, Shannon. Okay, COVID-2 testing on asymptomatic individuals. This was an interesting one. This one, there was a document, it was very confusing, and there's some history in here, but it's very confusing. In December of 2020, CMS issued a policy to exercise CLIA enforcement discretion for the use of authorized SARS-CoV molecular and antigen testing on asymptomatic individuals. So outside of really what the test was authorized for, it said, yes, we can test asymptomatic individuals as well. And that was back again in December of 2020. So if we think back to where we were at that point, we didn't have the home tests, we didn't have self-testing, all of that around. And so September 26th, actually, of this year, right around there, CMS issued a memo that stated, effective immediately, all CLIA certified labs are required to follow the manufacturer's instructions for use regarding the intended use of the SARS-CoV testing. They made references to the flexibilities extended in December of 2020 and how that was to maximize the availability of COVID testing to the general public, because we didn't have that home and self-testing option at that time. And then, hold on, just when you thought that was the answer, so they came back on like a week and a half later, beginning of October, and said, we're rescinding what we just said. We're rescinding what we just said. CMS will continue to exercise that enforcement discretion for the duration of the PHE. So it was a confusing one. Just wanted to kind of touch base on that because of the confusion that was associated with that. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about, so those are all things that have come through this year. So let's talk about what's in that pipeline. What are we going to, what are they working on? So proposed CLIA changes. This was a big document that came out, CMS 3326P that came out in mid-July timeframe that came out. And it really was talking about proposed changes to CLIA. This is something that's been in the works for a few years now. A few years ago, I can't remember exactly when, I think it was 19 again, where they put out some proposed questions and comments were submitted, and these are the proposed changes to those. These aren't finalized yet. I would kind of expect that in next year to see that, but we know how sometimes it takes a little longer. So one of the proposed changes that affects all of us is related to fees. There are 3 types of fees mentioned in the proposed rule: certificate fees, compliance fees, and then what they called other fees. So some of those highlights include imposing a 20% across the board increase to existing fees. This is an immediate one-time across the board 20% increase intended to stabilize the CLIA program and establish a baseline for future increases that would be imposed every 2 years. They're also proposing collecting a one-time $25 certificate fee increase for certificate of waiver laboratories. Again, it's to recover the cost of categorizing waived tests by the FDA at the end of the PHE. They're proposing increasing the user fees every 2 years based on the consumer price index to account for inflation. That's something we have never seen before. Fees would increase if needed to meet the CLIA program obligations. CLIA is a self-paid arm of the government. So these would be regular 2-year increases for inflation that we're talking about. If the inflation adjustment isn't enough to cover program obligations, an additional across the board amount would be adjusted to that. The adjusted fees would then become part of the baseline for the next 2 years. So we're definitely going to see some fee increases coming. Historically, so switching gears, so historically CMS has not exercised its authority under CLIA to collect those other fees from labs to cover administrative costs, but now they're planning to do so. So they're planning a fee for follow-up surveys. These are follow-up surveys to determine correction of any deficit practices, any deficiencies they've seen found in either a certificate of compliance survey or a certificate of accreditation validation survey. A new fee to determine compliance when adding new specialties or subspecialties. A fee for each substantial complaint that they have received when they have to inspect for those. A fee for a desk review of unsuccessful PT performance. A fee for a replacement certificate when a lab loses or destroys its CLIA certificate and requests a replacement. Again, something we haven't seen there. A fee for issuing a revised certificate. So when you make changes to your certificate, like your CLIA lab director, that's usually the big one that people actually have happen changed. If they have to issue a new revised certificate, there'll be a fee associated with that as well. So the last time we saw fee changes was in 2018. And so it's been a while. It's been a while, but these are kind of substantial. Next slide, please, Shannon. Okay, a few other things in these proposed changes. One is currently CMS can impose alternative sanctions, such things as directed plans of correction, civil monetary penalties, on-site monitoring by the state instead of or in addition to principal sanctions for non-waived labs. The proposed rule would also extend those alternative sanctions to certificate of waiver labs that are not in compliance as well. So that's a change. Regarding histocompatibility, if your lab does histocompatibility, kind of pay a little attention to this, read this thoroughly. But really what they did is they're eliminating duplicative regulations. There's a section that's specific to histocompatibility. Some of the things that are in there were also in other general lab areas as well. So they kind of eliminated some of that. Another thing is personnel. CMS suggests that educational requirements and degrees have definitely changed since these were last updated in 2003, I think it was. And nurses play, and it really highlighted that how nurses play such a vital role in performing point of care testing in so many different situations, settings, scenarios. And so it talked a lot about nurses. So CMS will allow nurses with a nursing degree to perform high complexity testing going forward. Nurses would not qualify for those lab director, technical consultant, clinical consultant, or general supervisor roles though, unless they meet the current requirements for the current requirements, personnel requirements for that. So that's kind of a big change too from a nursing perspective. So jumping to the end of the PHE. In August, CMS released a document called Laboratories, CMS Flexibilities to Fight COVID-19. So this document was it's part of the roadmap to the end of the PHE kind of thing. It's an interesting document and I encourage you to read it if you've got the time to do it. It covers the CMS's plan to reestablish standards and requirements at the end of the PHE. And it has some direct impacts to CLIA, revenue impacts, and some other impacts that we might not think of necessarily from a lab perspective. But so I'll jump right into this one. As you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, CMS issued emergency waivers. They used regulatory authority to allow lab flexibilities during COVID. Regulatory authority meaning enforcement discretions. I've talked a little bit about that. Shannon did too, regarding those that were extended to the labs during COVID. And now they're working on how do we end that? How does this look at the end of the pandemic? What does the lab regulatory landscape look like post-PHE? So they've started to evaluate the CMS issued PHE blank waivers and flexibilities. They're taking a look at there. I would tell you they're really into three big buckets. One's assessing the needs to continue certain waivers. Another's assessing which flexibilities are the most useful in future PHEs. And the third is continuing to collaborate with other federal partners and healthcare industry to ensure the healthcare system is prepared to address those new future pandemics that we might see coming. Next slide, please. It also gave some indications to a few things that will be going away when the PHE ends. And there are kind of three big things. One's related to Medicare, one's really administrative burden, and the other is really CLIA. So I'll touch on these as we go here. So one is the special COVID-19 cash price transparency requirements under the CARES Act. That will be terminated at the end of the PHE, according to this document today. Again, that could change. We don't know. It's a fluid situation, but right now, that's what they're saying. There's certainly could be other requirements, other laws that can continue to apply though. Next is the Medicare payment for sending trained technicians to collect a sample from a homebound beneficiary or a non-hospital patient for COVID testing. Those payments, as of right now, they're saying will end post-PHE. Another covers Medicare paying for a beneficiary's first COVID test without a physician or practitioner order. This will end after the PHE, and Medicare will go back to requiring all COVID-19 and related testing to be ordered by a physician or practitioner. Regardless, so that first one's not free, so to speak. The lab, they also expedited the CLIA application process, and that will remain. in place. So they did do some nice work related to that. Labs will be allowed to begin testing as soon as they receive a CLIA number and pay the fee. Recently, in the last few years, CMS has really cleaned up their payment process. You can now go online and pay your fee with a credit card. So they'll send you the CLIA number. You could take that CLIA number, go online and pay the fee online. It sends you an email receipt that says you have paid that, and you can start testing as soon as you have that versus waiting for the actual physical certificate to arrive in the mail. The labs within a hospital allowed to hold a single CLIA certificate. I talked about that in the exceptions rule. That remains, and truthfully, that was there prior to PHE. It was just really re-highlighted. The pathologist review of pathology slides, digital imagings, and lab data remotely. We talked about that extensively earlier, that will remain with the enforcement discretion thing. The no separate CLIA certificate for the remote location is specific to the pathologist only. Again, that's through enforcement discretion. It's not really contingent on the PHE, but that's for pathologist only. Next slide, please. So there's other implications. Pharmacists, if you've got pharmacists who are ordering tests and they're permitted by their state, that would remain. Alternative specimen collection devices and media used, that was something that they said would remain for the most part. Stark law waivers, those will end though. There's certain waivers there that they will end. And then they have a provider enrollment hotline that they're going to shut down at the end of PHE. So that's what we know as of today. Moving on to CLIAC, and I want to mention CLIAC because it ties so much into what we see coming down the pipeline, these changes that we've talked about already, and that whole process. So CLIAC is a committee dedicated, it's ran by the CDC, but it's in partnership with the FDA and CLIA as well. And they also have, it's made up of members of those, but it's also made up of volunteer members from healthcare industry. There's even a patient safety mom on there. So it's made up of a wide range of individuals. And this group is really charged with making recommendations to HHS on changes to CLIA, on education, on quality, and then on potential changes to CLIA. That's really what CLIAC's role is. And what I really wanted to highlight here quickly, I know we're getting close on time here, is there's really 3 work groups going on right now in CLIAC that kind of give us an indication of what will come down the pipeline in the future. So the first one is Next Gen Sequencing Work Group. They are charged with providing advice back to the larger CLIAC group for consideration and making recommendations to the Department of Health and Human Services on the education, training, experience, and competencies that should be required by CLIA to qualify personnel performing next-gen sequencing, bioinformatic data analysis, and interpretation. So just throwing it out there that this is something that's probably coming down the pipeline in the future sometime. Next slide, please. Next one that is important to mention and keep in our back of our minds here is there's a CLIA certificate of waiver and a certificate of provider performed microscopy, PPM work group. So again, their charge is really specific to provide advice back to CLIAC for consideration and making recommendations to HHS for the potential need for expanding regulatory oversight of certificate of waivers and certificate of provider performed microscopy. So another big bucket topic. Next slide, please. Okay, there's a regulatory assessment work group, and we've kind of seen some things coming out of this one. Again, provide input back to the larger CLIAC group on how CLIA might specifically be updated, considering some reports that were given back in 2019 to this group on personnel, non-traditional workflow models. So think of the remote work that we're talking about, that's part of that, and next-gen sequencing work group. So again, on how to revise those CLIA regulations to meet today's testing world. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this one is, I really threw these in here for your benefit, because I think that as a from a lab perspective, we can learn from others. We can learn what CMS is looking for, what their target areas are, that type of thing, by looking and knowing what their top CLIA deficiencies were in the latest data that we have. So the latest data we have today is from 2021. And I'm just going to go through these quickly because we are getting close on time here. So the top 10 right now, the top deficiency is personnel competency assessment. The regulations require the lab establish and follow written policies, procedures to assess employee, and if applicable, the consultant competency. So that's the first one. The next one covers some analytical systems specific to defining criteria for the proper storage of reagents and specimens and test result reporting. The third one is a general lab system. So that's really talking at least twice a year. They need to that labs need to verify the accuracy of the test or procedure it performs for anything that's not included in Subpart I. The fourth one talks about verification of performance specifications. So, and then 5, rounding out the top 5 here, or the bottom 5, I guess it is. Halfway through the list is another analytical system requirement covering what's required to be included in procedure manuals. Next slide, please. Coming in at 6 is the procedure manual, that you need to have one and that it's available. Number 7 is another related to analytical systems. This one covers maintenance required as defined by and at least the frequency of the manufacturer. Number 8 is another analytical one. Covers not using reagents, media controls, calibration supplies past the expiration date. Number 9 is a post-analytical requirement regarding the elements needed on the test report. And rounding out the top 10 is one addressing the lab director's responsibility, specifically, specific to PT enrollment. This next slide, I also provided the Joint Commission top 5 deficiencies for your laboratory if you're inspected by the Joint Commission at all. So I'm not going to go through those, but they are there for you. Next slide, please. I think that might be it. Perfect. Questions and answers. Thank you.
So we have 2 questions so far, Jenny. The first one, maybe I'll toss to you.
Okay.
So regarding remote review, will enforcement discretion of remote review be withdrawn for toxicology analysis for drugs of abuse testing?
I don't know a specific enforcement discretion written for toxicology. I just know of the generic, the larger one that says for pathologists and other laboratory staff.
Yeah, so I think, my assumption here would be the answer is yes, that remote review will be withdrawn for toxicology analysis of drugs abuse testing, because I don't believe that's typically done by a pathologist.
Yes, I would agree with you, Shannon.
So CMS has been pretty clear that they're going to have this enforcement discretion be pretty narrow after the end of the PHE, and it's only pathologists. All right, then the next question is if CLIA lab fees every 2, this is a great question, by the way, if CLIA lab fees every 2 years in line with the consumer price index, wouldn't it be logical to similarly adjust the clinical laboratory fee schedule in line with CPI as well? Any discussion of that? So I'm not aware of any discussion of that. And the cynical part of me has to think it's because, fees are what we pay into the government. And so they are incentivized to have those keep up with inflation. Whereas the fee schedule is what the government pays out to laboratories. And so to some extent, they are incentivized to not necessarily keep up with inflation. They want to keep costs down. So to my knowledge, there is not any real discussion of CPI as it relates to Medicare reimbursement of lab tests.
That was a great question and a great answer, and I completely agree with that.
All right, we don't have any other questions right now, so we'll just maybe give it 10 seconds if anyone has a question they want to type in quick. Jenny and I'd be happy to get to those. All right.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Jennifer. And thank you to everybody else for participating in today's Continual Improvement webinar. If you do have a question that you would like to have answered, please go ahead and indicate them on your evaluation that will be sent to you tomorrow. And please note that laboratory credit is extended for this program. Upon finalizing your evaluation, you will have the option to claim credit and print your certificate. If you had registered for this webinar and joined by phone only, please email us at mcleducation@mayo.edu if you do not receive the evaluation. And as a reminder, this program was recorded and will be archived in a few weeks. Thanks again for joining.
Thank you for participating. Please click the button below to complete the evaluation and obtain credit.